Hello, hi, good afternoon, good evening for some of the people online, and good morning also to the people online from North America. Welcome, dear colleagues and friends. Thank you for joining us today at the UN City. My name is Aissatou Maisha Diko. I'm the head of the World Bank UNHCR Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement, which is located right here at the UN City. Together with the government of Denmark, I'm delighted to host today's launch of the latest editions of the World Bank Poverty, Prosperity, and Planet Report titled Pathways Out of Polycrisis. But maybe before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping points. Again, this is a hybrid event with participants joining here today with us, but also some people joining online from across the globe. For those online, if you do experience any technical difficulties or wish to communicate, please do use the chat function to reach out to our support team. After today's panel conversation, we will have Q&A session. So for those people joining online, please use the chat function to submit your question, comment. We have colleagues in the room here monitoring the chat, and then we'll relay them to the panel as needed. For those that are in the room, please just raise your hand, and then I'll make sure that you have the microphone to pose your questions. Again, I would like to underline that these events will be recorded and filmed. If you wish to speak, please keep that in mind. And then a final point for those of you here today with us, we have a reception just after the launch. And then for our panelists, I'll keep track of time, but also some of the people in questions so that we can end on time, and then we can have a very interactive session. Now, coming back to the Poverty, Prosperity, and Planet Report. It's a biennial series that monitors progress towards the World Bank mission to end poverty and boost shared prosperity on a livable planet. This report represents the culmination of extensive research, analysis, and collaboration, and we're excited to share and discuss its findings with you today. And we are happy to have Luis Felipe and Maria Eugenia, one of the lead authors, with us today. So the report offering the first post-COVID-19 assessment of global progress on this interlinked agenda, the report finds that global poverty reduction has resumed, but at a pace slower than COVID-19 crisis. Nearly 700 million people worldwide live in extreme poverty with less than 2.15 per person per day. But poverty is not evenly spread. Today, extreme poverty is concentrated mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and in fragile settings. And even within such pockets of high poverty, poverty among the specific groups tends to be even higher than average. This includes refugees, internally displaced persons, and stateless persons, that the vast majority of which live in developing countries. And then we have seen that where evidence on forcibly displaced population in developing countries exists, it shows, and very consistently, that refugees experience higher poverty rates than nationals. For example, in Chad, 80% of refugee poverty compared to 42% of national. In Ethiopia, 66% among refugees versus 30% among national. And in Uganda, 46% of refugees compared to with 17% of the host population. So what does those numbers mean? It seems clear that reducing poverty among vulnerable groups, including forcibly displaced, deserve special attention if we want to eradicate extreme poverty. But fortunately, pathways to addressing these heightened poverty levels among displaced population in developed countries exist. While refugees and IDPs may have lost assets and experienced trauma, they are also incredibly resilient, and if given the right opportunity, of course, they can contribute to the local economy and become self-reliant. The evidence shows that refugees will live in countries with less restriction to access work, such as Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Costa Rica, had lower poverty rates compared to refugees living in neighboring countries with more restrictive access to employment. Another study has shown that Venezuelan refugees and migrants in Colombia benefited greatly from having their legal status regularized, reporting 48% higher consumption and 22% of more income, boosting both their well-being and also the economy. These examples that I just shared emphasize the complexity of poverty dynamics, not only but also within countries. Data and evidence help us to better understand the situation and give us means to take informed action. At the Joint Data Center, our mission is to enhance the ability of stakeholders to make timely and evidence-informed decisions that can improve the life of the forcibly displaced and their hosts. Improving the granularity of national poverty data is an essential part of our mission. We help governments across the globe to fix statistical blind spot that I mentioned earlier and sensitize their poverty data to the displaced subpopulation they host. Ladies and gentlemen, today we will kick off today's event with a presentation of the Poverty, Prosperity, and Planet report. And then inspired and informed, we will then hear a discussion with our distinguished panelists here through contribution and questions from the audience through a Q&A. For the presentation report, I'm delighted to invite Luis-Felipe Calva to the stage, who is the Global Director for the World Bank Poverty and Equity Practice, joined by Maria Eugenia, Senior Economist, who is led the development of the report. Luis-Felipe, over.
Thank you very much. I understand my microphone is working, so good afternoon. Thank you, Aisha. It is really a privilege to be here in UNCT and to not only present the report, but also it's a tribute and to celebrate our partnership with UNHCR. I will give a very brief introduction to the report, but I also want to thank the government of Denmark for all the support and for hosting us and for the good technical conversations that we had this morning to continue feeding into the design of our strategy. Two very brief points to introduce. First is that this global report is part of a commitment that we have to monitor global welfare every 2 years. But very important that a few years ago, after a long period of discussions and consultations, very extensive consultations, the board of the World Bank approved the new mission document for the bank, in which the renewed mission statement, as you know, is that the commitment of the bank is to end extreme poverty and foster shared prosperity on a livable planet. And that is not only a statement, it involves first a reflection on what it means to see the development process as an interlinked set of objectives, that we cannot see poverty, growth, climate, and so on as separate issues. We need to really think about this in its complexity. So this report is an attempt to actually deliver on that as a first attempt to bring an integrated approach to these different objectives in our mission. So that is something that hopefully we will have time to discuss with you in the Q&A. But Maria Eugenia Genoni co-led with a group of colleagues from the research department and the Poverty and Equity Global Practice to produce this report. I insist, tackling the challenge of looking at the different objectives in a very integrated way. Second point I want to make is that the bank sees itself as having three fundamental pillars in terms of what we deliver to countries, and this is related to what we call the lending bank, the knowledge bank, and the data bank. We see these as the three pieces that together can help us support countries, bring the knowledge that is needed, but also support the generation of data and evidence that improve the quality of policy making. In that respect, I just want to say that our Joint Data Center, with UNHCR, it's at the core of these 3 different pillars. It really helps us gather better data in very complicated settings and for populations that are particularly vulnerable. It also allows us to generate knowledge about how to improve their lives, and then that feeds into our operations with very specific recommendations. So it's really important that we continue supporting this work. And I have to also say that thanks to our partnership with UNHCR, we also were able to produce the first poverty assessment for Central African Republic to collect data in very complicated settings. So we really celebrate this partnership, and we are here to present our report. I will give the floor to Maria Eugenia now. We will be happy to elaborate on many details of the report as the conversation unfolds. And very privileged to be part of this distinguished panel. So let me give the floor to my colleague Maria Eugenia Giannoni now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Luis Felipe was mentioning, this is the first report that tries to look at this integrated mission of eradication of extreme poverty, boosting shared prosperity on a livable planet. So what we're trying to do in this report is leverage huge efforts on the data collection front to present a first post-pandemic assessment on where the world stands on these interlinked goals. So just the key messages that will come from the first part of the report are: the first is that the world will not meet the SDG 1 by 2030. And at the current pace of economic growth and the nature and quality of economic growth, it will take decades to eradicate extreme poverty, and more than a century to lift people above the $685 a day line, which is a line that is more representative of the poverty of upper middle income countries. A second message of the report, which is related to this, is the fact that progress in terms of shared prosperity, in terms of reducing the global prosperity gap, has reached a standstill since the pandemic, reflecting this slowdown in the overall economic growth and inclusiveness of growth. And finally, the report looks also at the levels of vulnerability, in the sense, particularly around weather events, extreme weather events. And it presents the first global measure of the extent of the risk to extreme weather events. And it shows that about 1 in 5 people are at risk of experiencing welfare losses due to an extreme weather event, which they will struggle to recover from. Building on the diagnostic, the second part of the report is try to look at where are the pathways, how would you move forward? And in that sense, in a way, it explores, the different pathways out of this polycrisis, taking seriously trade-offs between this tension between rising incomes and protecting the planet, but also the complementarity across objectives. And in the end, it concludes that in a context where there are such constrained levels of resources, it's important to prioritize and, in a way, focus investments where there is the highest return in terms of progress for the interlinked goals. And so in that sense, what the report conveys is that for low-income and very fragile settings, it's very important to prioritize poverty reduction by delivering investments in human capital, financial, and physical capital. For the middle-income countries, where there are still high levels of poverty and vulnerability, but there is also emissions may not be necessarily trivial, it's very important to prioritize income growth, but also identifying synergistic policies that can be scaled up, such as, for instance, battling air pollution. And for upper middle-income countries and high-income countries, it's very important to prioritize mitigation actions to reduce the probability of these hazards going forward, while, of course, understanding and managing these different transition costs that will occur. So let me go a bit more in depth into the trends. So this first set of figures is showing the trends in extreme poverty reduction. On the left, you find the rates, and on the right, the number of people. So as you see, historically, it has been substantial progress. So we cannot deny that progress. But recently, we see that these lines have, in a way, slowed down significantly, particularly after the pandemic. So today, about 8.5% of the global population is living under extreme poverty. That means under $2.15 a day. And if we look at a higher poverty line, which are also now tracking in the vision, what you can see is that the poverty rates have declined, but still about 44% of the world is living under $685 a day. And what is important to highlight on these trends is that because of population growth, the number of people living under in these poverty levels hasn't changed much since the 1990s, which is the figure on the right. And this reflects many factors, right? So on the one hand, the slowdown in economic growth, particularly before the pandemic for poor countries, the scarring impacts of the pandemic, the concentration and changing geography of poverty, and also the increasing fragility and conflicts. For instance, when looking at the trends post-pandemic, here we're comparing the poverty rates with the levels in 2019, right? We see that for the poorest countries, the poverty rates are still above pre-pandemic levels. It's very important to note that while the progress was significant historically, that also came with a very different composition of the poverty geographically. So a large part of that progress was driven by China, East Asian Pacific, and also South Asia. And the combination of that substantive progress with population growth in Sub-Saharan Africa in particular is making poverty concentrated particularly in these settings. And another way to look at that is if we look at the distribution of the extreme poor, right, in Sub-Saharan Africa and fragile and conflict-afflicted settings. So by 2030, we expect 9 out of 10 of the extreme poor to be living either in Sub-Saharan Africa or in an FCB setting. So that means the frontier of extreme poverty reduction will lie on this very challenging context. And so we also did analysis on terms of how much it will take to make progress. Let's say looking at the levels of economic growth and the levels of inclusiveness of that economic growth. At different projections, what it shows is that it will take many years. We really need to accelerate the levels of growth, but also accelerate the income growth of those at the bottom of the distribution. But at the current trends, it will take many years, decades to eradicate extreme poverty. And so in that sense, it's very important to also track shared prosperity, and we have a new measure of shared prosperity, which is the prosperity gap, which in a way measures or captures this combined effect of growing average incomes, but also puts more weight to incomes of the bottom. So if the incomes of the bottom grow faster, the prosperity gap falls faster. And so as I described with poverty, there has been substantial progress in the inclusiveness of growth worldwide, but lately there has been a stagnation. And that stagnation is a combined effect of slower overall income growth, but in particular a divergence in incomes across countries. One thing that now the bank is tracking explicitly is also high levels of inequality at the country level. So one of the important monitoring indicator now is the number of countries with high levels of inequality. And one thing that we point out in this report is that there are still significant number of countries with inequality levels that are extremely high. This is based on a Gini index and based on a very specific measure, but still it shows that particularly in the regions where we need this economic growth to be very inclusive, inequality is quite high. Now, the other measure that we bring in this report, that is also another vision indicator that we track, is this vulnerability risks to weather events. And this is a new measure that in a way looks at whether a person is at risk of a climate hazard by looking at their exposure to different types of weather events, but also looks at the vulnerability to experience losses. You could be exposed to a hazard, but not necessarily vulnerable to feel their impacts. And this is a multidimensional measure that takes into account the physical vulnerability, but also the ability to cope based on income, education, etc. So this is now was done globally and allows us to count the number of people at risk. And so let me just illustrate the numbers. This is just a distribution of the world, the population by region. The blue circles show the population exposed to these different hazards. As you can see, it's a large levels of exposure across the world. But what this measure helps from a policy perspective to understand where the vulnerabilities lie. And here you can see that there is high levels of vulnerability, of risk. But let's look at, for instance, Sub-Saharan Africa. In Sub-Saharan Africa, you don't see the blue line, which means that almost everybody who's exposed to these hazards will be negatively affected. Whereas if you compare, for instance, North America, there is high levels of exposure, but the vulnerability, the risks are low because the adaptation capacity is much higher. And that also helps us understand what are the constraints and the policies that we can act on to reduce this level of risk. In terms of going forward, very quickly, the report highlights the importance of both growing the incomes of the poor and highlight particularly the centrality of the labor market or investing in the productive capacity of the poor, and also in enabling structural conditions for socioeconomic mobility, right? But in addition, we highlight the importance of protecting people from these extreme weather events and enhancing the ability to manage and have this risk management on hand. Two things that are very connected. But when looking at the pathways, one thing that we highlight is that policymakers will have to make difficult choices and prioritize. And in that process, it's important to take into account the trade-offs, the fact that some of these things may not go together, like growing incomes in a particular setting may be associated with higher emissions, for instance. The constraints to scale up synergistic policies. We know that there are policies that can help advance on many fronts together, but what are the constraints to actually advance on that front? And finally, the transition costs. So what are the short-term transition costs? Who is going to lose? Who is going to win? And how we compensate that process to have a just transition. And in that sense, I think it's very important to highlight that at the global level where the poor are located and where emissions are and will be generated. So this slide is simply showing that extreme poverty is concentrated, of course, in low and low middle income countries, whereas emissions are largely concentrated in high income and upper middle income countries today and going forward. And the focus is truly eradicating extreme poverty, right? Even at current technologies, the cost in terms of emissions, the simulation suggests, is not going to be very high because these countries that host a large number of extreme poor are not generators of emissions. But if the focus is lifting half of the world out of the $685 a day line, there's going to be a tension. And we need to understand that tension at the country level to manage those elements. So what the report ends up highlighting is important of, in a way, doing what matters where it matters. Where do we put, this marginal dollar? And in that sense, as I mentioned before, while this is not a prioritization tool at the country level, what we're highlighting is low-income countries prioritize poverty, middle-income countries reduce vulnerability and exploit these synergies, scale up these synergies, and finally, upper middle-income countries prioritize mitigation while managing these transition costs. We again highlight the importance of the data agenda. It's critical. We need to understand the multidimensionality of these challenges, both strengthening the statistical systems, but also in terms of monitoring, because conditions evolve very broadly. And of course, we finalize highlighting the importance of global and coordinated action to advance on these interlinked goals. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much. I'll pass the word to Luis Felipe to do some final remarks on how we operationalize this report.
Sure, thank you. And I will take 1 minute. I know we're late, so we are already out of time. So we just wanted to tell you a few things. So one is, in a few weeks, we will have new updated numbers based on two corrections. One is we're updating the international comparisons based on differentials in cost of living, what is called the purchasing power parity correction. So we have corrected all the numbers by new differentials in cost of living across countries. And second, based on the methodologies that we use every 5 years, we're updating the poverty line as well. So based on that poverty line, the new poverty line and new PPP factors, we will be presenting new global numbers. I just want to say that the numbers will be slightly different, but certainly the story doesn't change. So basically the idea is the trends and the concentration in terms of the regions and so on is not going to present a big change. Let me move because Second, very important, is we are preparing as we speak a companion report to this one based specifically to discuss what it means to end poverty on a livable planet in fragility contexts. So we bring the layer of governance, territorial presence of the state, non-state actors, and conflict, how that affects our capacity to end poverty on a livable planet. And we are doing it jointly with researchers at UNU wider. And also, we are having a full companion for the report with a gender lens that we hope to be launching very soon. Finally, the 5 pieces of analytics that we prepare at country level in the World Bank that feed into the country dialogue and the operational work of the bank. One of those 5 is precisely the poverty and equity assessments that we do at country level. And the idea is that this is the instrument to bring all these global messages and global framework to a very specific, to the very specific context of each country that sets the priorities that feed into the country dialogue and engagement. So there is a full circle from analytics to operations. Finally, just to say that we have these 2 instruments for engagement with partners, the Global Data Facility and the Umbrella Facility for Poverty and Equity, which are multi-donor trust funds that really allow our work to be more innovative, creative, and to support countries. So we are very, very grateful to the partners who support these two instruments. You can go to this QR and find all the details of the report. Final point is, as per World Bank policy, all that is in the report now is replicable. So you can go download all the data. You can all the numbers in terms of poverty and inequality are fully transparent. You can find all the methodological documents with all the methodological decisions very well explained, and you can use the data and you can see the coding that was used to generate those numbers. So full transparency, which is our policy since a few years ago. So we're happy to interact with you along that basis. Everything you want to have in terms of the background documents for the report are available as well. So let's open now for the conversation. Back to you, Aisha.
Thank you so very much, Luis Felipe and Maria Eugenia, for those sobering results, especially under the context that we're operating, but also the opportunities that exist within this, where we have to be collectively, working together. But also Luis Felipe for outlining at the country level, how does the bank intend to, implement, operationalize, and unpack this. But also, as everything that the bank does, it is as part of a global public good. Yes, I think now is the time for us to start, the panel conversation, but we'll start with opening remarks with Ole Tonke, who has 2 hats. He is representing the government of Denmark, also the climate, champion for Denmark, but also as part of the management committee member of the Joint Data Center. Ole, you have heard both Luis Felipe and Maria Eugenia present, where do we think we're off track in terms of missing the SDGs, but also the geopolitical development have changed overnight. So what does it mean in terms of, collective, given the geopolitical climate and existential question about international cooperation being raised right now? Where do you see scope for progress in achieving the interlinked goals of ending poverty and boosting shared prosperity on a livable planet? Ole, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That was a very easy question to throw at me as a start of this conversation. First of all, a huge thank you. Both for having this conference, but also for all the work you put into to this. It reminded me a little bit, took me back to when I started out as a first secretary and was posted to Benin in 2003, because at that time the poverty reports and the poverty data was the foundation for everything we did as such. And somehow, I don't know, it seems that has been a little bit lost in the last 5 years or so, somehow. not that many people are talking about the data on poverty and where are we, at least in my opinion, not as much as we should, since I'm also an economist, and this is candy for me. So a huge thank you for you to produce this report and these results. So we actually have a solid data foundation to take some decisions and choose some policies on. So that's really helpful and useful, especially these days. As per your question, I mean, it's difficult to continue and for me to be an optimist in terms of the work we do. Somehow I mean, what we witnessed geopolitically obviously is not helpful for global development, if I can put it that way. And when it comes on top, or when we on top of that has some of the biggest development partners of the world choosing to scale down their level of development assistance, things become really bleak, if I can put it that way. And it's, for me, there are some fundamental changes, shifts right now in the way we have international development partnerships and cooperation that we need to really think hard about. Somehow, I mean, we must acknowledge that other agendas have surpassed us and seem more attractive and important for our politicians. But also, I think we have to think about, have we been good enough in explaining why this is important? Also, why is this important for us in Denmark or in UK or in the US, etc., etc.? What do we get out of our development partnerships with the countries in Africa, for instance? So, for me, getting that story and narrative changed and making everybody realize that we have a huge interest also in having these development partnerships. There's a lot of benefits, especially in the long run for countries in the global north on this. Really needs to come out much more clearly, I believe, because at least the result right now is that the decision makers apparently can't see it, if I can put it that way, because the policies they choose right now are different. So we are in the midst of formulating a new strategy for development cooperation for Denmark. It's the one we have is expiring, but the time is also really relevant, if I can put it that way. And this is one of the considerations that we are really trying to think hard about. So any input from the great panel today on that would be really useful for me. We are trying to think about, so what would be like the main interests for Denmark in our global partnerships, and some of them are obvious and everybody talks about them, ranging from reducing conflict and wars, migration is key, and it's also according to your data, I noted that you find the most people in the extreme poverty exactly amongst that group of people. We spend 25%, I believe, of our development assistance on humanitarian efforts, and that's targeted directly at the most poor and needed people on the planet. That story doesn't even come out, more or less. So that's at least one clear interest, and where we need to talk more about it, I believe. The other one, you also pointed to it, climate change. I mean, if the rest of the world also doesn't do a green transition, then in 10, 15 years' time, for sure we will not meet the climate targets that we set out in the Paris Agreement, because the growing energy needs in the developing countries, if that is based on fossil fuels, will get nowhere. So we have also from Denmark's side a clear interest in that transition is also undertaken in emerging economies, for sure. But also emerging markets. We also, as Denmark, has a huge interest in that these markets grow and become attractive and accessible for Danish companies and vice versa, that we also can import goods for Danish consumers for these markets. And then finally, in the way the world is turning right now, is not in the foreign policy interest of Denmark, if I could put it that way. We are a small open economy. We thrive on multilateralism, on rule-based society. If you look at many of the emerging economies and developing countries in the world, they are in the same position actually. They are also multilateralists, because they have an interest in a well-functioning, rules-based international order and systems that they can trust as such. So those are some of the areas, themes that we are thinking about, and that again relates, I believe, perfectly to what you presented, because and going a pillar below that is then how do we work with the countries that we partner up with, and the key thing is that we listen more to their interest and to what they need, where can we benefit from each other, and again one of your policy conclusions were that they need different things, so we have to apply different policies and areas of collaboration differently according to each different country, because they're all different, their contexts differ. So we can't just say that we from Denmark, we only do that in the whole world. That will not work. We have to adapt it as such. And then we also need to be more flexible, able to adapt very quickly, since the world is changing really fast now. So think hard about how do you make a strategy with a 4 or 5 year time span, but that you are actually able to adjust as you go along, because otherwise you will get stuck. The current strategy, I think after a couple of months, Ukraine happened. So, okay, we have to react. We adapt, but there was nothing about it in our strategy as such. Thinking about that. And then coming back to the going or downward trend on development assistance at a global level, Denmark cannot fill that gap, that's for sure. I'm not sure EU can, actually. I'm not sure anybody can. We've been saying that we need more innovative financing for the last 10, 15 years. We do, but we've also found out that it's not as easy as we had thought or hoped it would be. I think we've come some way and we found some solutions, but I think we really need to do much more of that and think much more broadly about innovative financing. It's not only for climate change, it's also for other areas. We need to think more of guarantees as a way forward. We worked very closely also with the World Bank on hybrid capital, for instance. It's a way forward on this international financial architecture that we need to think much more about as such. So I think I'll leave it at that, but again, a huge thank you to both Joint Data Center and World Bank for all your input. It's really needed for us, and it's great that we have some data, some factual foundation for discussion. And again, really looking forward to hearing my fellow panelists answer this question moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ole, and thank you for also, outlining, in terms of strategy where the Denmark is planning on going and how the work that's being led by Louis-Philippe and the team is going to be fitting in that, but also the conversation that we are having. I think one thing that I picked up from your intervention is just like no country can do it all. You need multilateralism, it needs to be but also, we always tend to see that, it's a burden sharing, but the global north would have gain in terms of investing, bringing out and lifting the global south. So thank you for that. So now we'll turn to Louis-Philippe. Louis-Philippe, in your view, what are the most urgent action required at the global level to really address the interconnectedness between poverty, prosperity, and climate change? And then where do you see scope for opportunities and progress despite the many constraints that, Maria Eugenia has outlined that this country is facing? And then, despite all of this uncertainty, and we see some countries that are already trying to do things, forging their own path, including in building and strengthening their data and evidence base. How do you see this in your work? And how do you think we should be, as a global community, capitalize on this?
Thank you. There are several questions in your general question. So I will try to address briefly some of them. So the first one is, what do we have to do? So the first thing I think is important, and we stress that in the report, is precisely to think of the different goals as jointly determined and interlinked. We cannot continue thinking about economic growth separately from how inclusive growth is, separately from how sustainable it is. So we really have to think in an integrated way. This is, I think, where the world is moving conceptually. But then we have to understand what that means for doing policy differently. So second is, in order to do policy better or to design better policy, we need to collect, generate better data and evidence. And we have been discussing during the previous days how these type of analysis reports and many others that many other actors do in the international arena can really be better at creating evidence-based narratives, not only evidence-based policies, but also evidence-based narratives that compete and gain space in the public debate against narratives that are not based in facts. So, and for that, we need to collect better data. We need to continue strengthening the capacity of countries to generate data and to use it. But also, I insist, we need to understand how to communicate better. Because at the end, that's what creates consensus around specific policies. And the third is, as was mentioned before, the idea that we need to be very context specific. We cannot have one recipe that is applied everywhere. We need to work. That's why we believe it is very important to have these instruments like the poverty and equity assessments at the country level. Why? Because we need to understand the specificity in each context and what are the priorities. As we present in the report, there is a very good, there are principles to define the priorities that we have to understand in each context. And on that, I emphasize the context of fragility and conflict-affected situations in which we are trying to come up with this companion report that hopefully would shed light on how to address, how to build the enabling environment for better policy in contexts in which even if we know what the best policies are or the potentially good policies are, the context is not enabling the action because of all these complicated political situation. And to really, with this I close, to really bring a development perspective even when we are having humanitarian interventions. I think this link between humanitarian and development perspectives is fundamental, particularly in this context. We are more effective, and I would even argue more cost-effective, if we bring a development perspective when we are doing humanitarian interventions, because at the end, what we want to make these interventions not necessary and the development process sustainable is by giving people back their agency. The link between transitioning from humanitarian to development action is by giving people back their agency. So I would say all these elements can help us be more effective. And I firmly believe that some of the examples that are presented in the report, and we have many others in different work that we can make available, is a way to really inform specific actions in countries. And I think we as a development community, not as a World Bank, but as a development community, should use these evidence-based narratives more extensively.
Thank you very much, Luis Felipe. I think one thing that I've really captured that's very important and then also resonates so much with the work that we're doing at the JDN is just bridging this, the nexus, giving people back their agency. I think that's something that's very critical as we're looking at, helping strengthen the resilience and then addressing the compounding risk that the most vulnerable are facing. So I don't know whether you want to address the final question, or should I just go in the private sector? Because
no, let's let
sounds good.
The other panelists.
Thank you so very much.
Want to hear and learn.
Yes, exactly, Marie. We know, especially on the developing country, that countries cannot do it all. Private sector have a very critical role to play in terms of, shared prosperity and poverty reduction. How does the private sector think about interlinked goal of ending poverty and boosting shared prosperity on a livable planet? That's the first. And then the second question, is there an opening for broader partnership, including with the private sector, and what that would look like to,
Yeah.
from you? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm from the Confederation of Danish Industry, but I will answer both on behalf of Danish industry, but also on a broader perspective, since we work very closely with the private sector in a wide range of developing countries. We work closely with business associations and employers associations on job creation, green transition, and a number of other issues. And I think I was really happy, of course, to see in the presentation that one of the pathways that was called for was better functioning labor markets. And I think you also pointed to a need for better education, for more productive labor forces. Of course, I very much agree to those 2 points as ways out of crisis. Of course, both focus on employment, on self-employment, at a number of different levels. When we look at experiences from where we are, it's clear, I think, that we are not always exploiting the opportunities that lie within the innovative capacities of people. Whether you go to a refugee camp or you look at a regular sort of labor market, there are much more opportunities that we are exploiting at the moment. Local business associations are facing a number of barriers when they try to advocate for better framework conditions for creating employment, but also just not when we look at not sort of the formal labor market, but just in informal sectors where we are talking about eradicating poverty and extreme poverty. When we give opportunity, a lot of people will grasp that opportunity and pull themselves out of poverty as well. So when we come to the question about partnerships, I think that as an international community, we haven't been good enough at using the partnership with the private sector, to be honest. There are not a lot of Western business associations that are as engaged as we are in international partnerships with our peers in developing countries. But when we do meet and get together, I'm a vice chair at the business at the OECD's development group. When we get together, there's always a big frustration, because there is a sense that the private sector is being kept a little bit at bay. And I understand the reasons why. I just think we need to get past that. Especially as the world looks today, we really need to find some solutions to get past that. And similarly, when we look locally at some of the experiences that we have from working together with local business associations, there is a sense among I would say almost all the business associations that I meet, and even in different regions, that there is a lot of aid given for better employability, some training, but it's often a distance from the actual labor market. The ones doing the training are not actual labor market partners. And it leads to people that are better trained, but it doesn't necessarily lead to employability. So we have, or employment, in fact, and we are facing this. We are facing this in many places, and I think it's great that a lot of development partners want to contribute to better employability, but the only way to go to actual employment is to do it via the labor market. And that might be the formal labor market. There's also a possibility of doing it on the informal labor market when we talk about sort of the poorer communities and so on. We need to look at the entire spectrum here. But that would be one of the key points actually that I would point to also in terms of making the real change going forward. When we work a lot these days on technical and vocational education and training, also together with the trade unions. We have a model in Denmark where both the trade unions and the employers associations are very much engaged with the TVET system, meaning that we know what it is that the young people need to be able to do in order to get a job at the companies. And on the other hand, companies are willing to give traineeships because they know they will get very employable youth. That's very, very different in most of the countries where we go. We see schools that are poorly equipped. They're equipped for not just yesterday's workplaces, but for the workplaces of 10, 20 years ago. And the ones deciding the curriculum is not the companies. That's the somewhere in a ministry. So I think I'm not pointing to any win-win solutions here. It's all difficult, but I think there is definitely an unexploited potential in really going together with the local labor market partners.
Yeah, thank you so very much. I forgot to mention earlier that Mary Gad Hansen is the Director for Global Development and Sustainability at the Confederation of Danish Industry and Vice Chair at the BIAC Development Committee. So thank you so very much. Thank you for reminding us that we should be tapping and leveraging more with the partnership with the private sector as we're looking at solution. And I think one of the issues that you are talking about between the matching between supply and demand is so common, not just for the developing country, but also as we're looking. And this is particularly important as we're looking at self-reliance for the forcibly displaced. And that brings me to my next question to Charlotte Slente, who is the Secretary General of the Danish Refugee Council. Charlotte, what special, you've heard the report, you've heard the panelists, no? So what special report consideration and action would need to be taken to ensure that the vulnerable people, including the forcibly displaced, are really not left behind as we're looking at, solution to eradicate extreme poverty and shared prosperity in a livable planet?
Thank you very much for that question, and thank you for presenting your very thought-provoking report, and for, as Ole said, bringing data back into the room here, which I think is a basis for everything we need to do in the future. First of all, a few words about the Danish Refugee Council. We are a displacement-focused NGO that works in 40 countries around the world. We provide life-saving emergency assistance, but we also provide support for durable, long-term solutions for people who are displaced. As we sit here today, unmet humanitarian needs are skyrocketing to unprecedented levels. And humanitarian organizations have in recent days been left reeling from the announcements of the US government over the last month. First to freeze all aid grants during a 90 days review period. And now from last Wednesday, 2 days ago, the US government has cancelled nearly all of its foreign aid grants, more than 10,000 grants globally. This will have catastrophic implications for millions of people, including forcibly displaced and people living in conflict zones around the world. And just to give you, from this large ecosystem that the US government used to support and was a strong partner in, a small piece in that ecosystem, for us it means the loss of an ability to service 2 million people this year, a loss of program income to do so of $160 million, and we are now thrown into a situation where we need to lay off, release up to 2,000 of our staff globally. So quite tremendous implications. 1/5 of our program portfolio is slashed from one night to the next. I say that as an example of how the situation is across the humanitarian sector and the development sector at this moment in time when such a big global donor decides with such an urgency in an unprecedented way to finish and terminate contracts globally. But even before this happened, I think it's fair to say that the humanitarian system was to some degree broken because there were too few resources to tackle the needs of so many displaced people and people with humanitarian needs around the globe. Today, the world counts 122 million displaced, forcibly displaced, and we have an AI forecasting mechanism that actually predicts now that 7 million more people will be forcibly displaced by the end of this year, due to the combined effects of rising conflicts and climate-induced disasters. So one message that we could have at this moment is that we need to work better together to cater for the needs of all these displaced people, but also work on prevention. And I'm going to focus a little bit here on prevention. I think it's been out there for a number of years that preventing is much less costly than actually intervening after crisis emerges. And I think we need to remember this message very clearly at this moment in time where resources internationally will become more scarce. I think the World Development or the World Bank itself has actually published a study that shows that $1 invested in peace building saves $16 in crisis response. So the cost effectiveness of prevention is obviously clear out there, whether in relation to conflict prevention or climate adaptation. But we see that the global investments is declining around the globe. So we need to get that prevention back on the table and, use a good crisis like this one is to actually do good and do better on prevention. The UN Secretary General has been calling out for focusing on prevention during his entire tenure. I don't think we have come far enough. Much more needs to be done. One of the examples from our little world, you would say, or from our programs is that in areas prone to chronic conflict and climate shocks, such as the Mandera Triangle in Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, we have since 2018 worked with local partners and government authorities in a EU-funded program called Boresha, where we try to use an integrated resilience approach to prevent displacement from happening. So this approach mixes peace building with disaster risk management, but also climate adaptation. And it helps communities anticipate and adapt and respond to the adverse impacts of climate shocks and armed conflicts. And a similar program is funded by Danida, which is now starting in the Karamoja border region of Kenya and Uganda. Just to demonstrate that working community-based out there with building that capacity in communities, you can actually get stuff done that has an immediate effect if you work preventative in those communities, and hampers displacement to take place because people can deal with their issues and stay where they come from. Another thing and another comment here I'd like to make is that this is not only about humanitarian action. It's not about saving lives again and again and again. It's about looking into longer term solutions to end displacement by actually focusing on development planning and socio-economic reintegration of people. We know that around the world, the major hosts of displaced people, they actually live in the global south. They are countries that are themselves prone to conflict, prone to climate effects, with limited institutional capacity, low income to low middle income countries who are very, very generous hosts of millions of refugees around the globe. These countries need to be supported to help integrate people who live in their societies year after year as displaced people, as refugees. So I actually like to thank the World Bank for leading the way here by establishing that IDA financing window for host communities and refugees. I think that is a very, very important approach at this moment in time. I'd also like to emphasize a Danish government example here and your bold investment in durable solutions to end displacement. It can be illustrated by one of the programs that Danida is funding in Uganda, the Uganda Refugee Resilience Initiative that is implemented by Save the Children and us and a number of local partners. And it has as its aim to create sustainable and durable solutions for Ugandans, refugees, focusing on districts where there are very high levels of poverty. So it's trying to tackle poverty in a poverty-prone area and at the same time trying to integrate the many refugees living in these areas. These people will not be able to go back to their countries of origin anytime soon. So can you integrate them into a labor market? Can you support not only capacity building, but actually creating possibilities for self-employment, for startups, for agricultural activities in integration with a local host community? I believe this is a very important way forward at this moment in time. One more thing, mitigating the impacts of displacement actually will require a lot. It will require shock-responsive social protection mechanisms that also include displaced populations, as well as using anticipatory action. And linking that with longer-term resilience building, such as the example I mentioned above called Boresha. But one example of how anticipatory action can help prevent and mitigate the impacts of displacements is DRC's AHEAD program. It is a 4-year program funded by the Netherlands that will expand anticipatory action across 7 different countries. So there we build on our Foresight platform to predictive modeling of displacement trends, and we collect analysis level protection and conflict trend data and work with communities to design actions and plans of actions to deliver on identified risks. So just to wrap up, I mean, proven and scalable solutions do exist to prevent forcible displacement, but they require political will, both among the member states to prioritize the rights of displaced people. They also require that we direct development and humanitarian efforts towards empowering local communities to drive change for improved resilience and self-reliance. And just maybe one comment to your request, Ole, as to where do we need to invest in a new strategy. You have talked a lot about the inequality in countries. I think we also need to look at inequality across countries, because what we're looking into is a world that becomes more and more unequal, because the fragile and conflict-prone countries are less attractive as investment partners as the more developed countries. So there's a risk here that the fragile countries, they fall into more and more poverty, more and more fragility, and that is obviously very disastrous for these countries and their populations, but it's a disaster for the entire world because it creates insecurity not only in these countries but regionally and globally. It creates big waves of conflict that drives refugee people to seek refuge due to these conflicts that are created. So I think, invest not in the countries that are capable of attracting other sources into their mix of resources, invest in bringing their populations up, but invest in the countries where it's very difficult to attract other kinds of funding. Stay engaged also in the countries where you do not like the regimes that are present there. Have a focus and a lens on the population in these countries. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, again for reminding us that how we have to be coming together when we're looking at integrative and sustainable, solutions, including on the solution pathway, both on the humanitarian and the government side, right? So, and then I wanted to use this also to say, I think the World Bank understood that very well with, this special window where we knew that government won't be able to do it all together. They need to rely on private sector. You have those either private sector window, that goes in helping de-risk investment for, private sector that should be working on those very difficult and complicated things. We're also, like you said, operating in a very resource-constrained environment, especially, So every single dollar need to work maybe double, triple time harder. So maybe we should be also focusing on some, especially like on the prevention side, So I think, that's a lot of food for thought for us. And then that brings me to our last panelist of today. Thomas Gammeltoft-Hansen is the professor and director of the Center of Excellence for Global Mobility Law. And then, Thomas, I also would like you to reflect on the same question that Charlotte was mentioning earlier. What special consideration action would need to be taken really for the vulnerable people, including the forcibly displaced, so that they're not left behind?
Thanks so much. Let me also just very briefly begin by congratulating Maria and her team on this report. This is the summary. The full report is here. It's 300 pages. I understand that's an even larger data set behind it. It's so nice to see. I think this type of publication has always been very important to our research, and I think the theme that you've chosen for this year on Polycrisis is also a particularly important way of kind of reaching out, understanding these very complex dynamics between poverty and a range of different societal issues. And then that said, I also wanted to sort of push a little bit in terms of saying that I think there is a particular sort of tethering that might be left behind. Even in addition to the people that are left behind, there's also almost an agenda that might be left behind in the kind of migration poverty link. And I know that, you've been doing excellent research in this area. I'm sure there's going to be follow-up reasons, and us, of course, being here to discuss it helps. But it's not just about this report. I think the migration poverty agenda has sort of vaned off in a lot of high-level discussions in recent years. It used to really be a very big thing. When I started out my academic career 20 years ago, migration development was still really top of the agenda. Denmark and especially the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was really lead on these issues, kind of taking charge. Danish Refugee Council was publishing on these issues. And yes, we know a bunch of things. There's still debates going on around brain drain and remittances and things like that, but it's actually quite reductive in terms of bringing it back to this very foundational link. Now, Of course, I'm a professor of a Center of Mobility Law, so I know what you're all thinking now. Of course, he's going to say that mobility is going to be important in the context of whatever, just insert X. But let me give you a fact, which is not my own, or actually an economic set of analyses that have been made by various economists and compiled by Michael Clements. If you imagine a world where you would, globally speaking, reduce all barriers to goods, to finance and to trade, you would reap economic benefits in the trillions and trillions of dollars, yeah? There's lots about that in this report. Lots of people are thinking about ways to somehow get even marginal incremental changes there. But there's a lot of analysis to suggest that if you then took the same barriers in relation to human mobility, barriers in relation to migrations, the collective benefit of removing all those, which of course will probably never happen, but it would be in the trillions, 2 to 3 times more than all that other stuff. That is just jaw-dropping for me, and I think it was jaw-dropping for the economists that did this. And even if this core dynamic is so well known, migration has been an economic development strategies since the beginning of human societies. It's still the fact that there's much of this that we don't really know and where we could reap benefits by moving forward. And the fact that today, the primary barriers to mobility, whether it's internal mobility or displacement or economic migration more transnationally, well, it used to be geographical and technical barriers. Today, these barriers are regulatory. It means that we can potentially do something about them. And I'm not sitting here advocating anything close to open borders, and anyone that knows me knows that I'm not thinking about that. But even, again, marginal, smaller initiatives in this area could have potentially very large-scale effects in poverty reduction. I'm thinking here about things around remittances, of course, that we talked about, the way that that can be linked and of course, supersedes foreign direct aid. I'm thinking about initiatives where we can see evidently kind of counterproductive strategies. Yeah? So my team works partly, for instance, in South America and West Africa. In West Africa, we see, for instance, the European Union as part of external migration policy actively, in a sense, trying to impose national forms of border control in an EU vein that actually undermines regional circulation and mobility, with clear impact, not just in terms of poverty, livelihoods, but, at least according to some studies, suggest you actually have the opposite of the intended result in terms of out-of-region mobility and migration, including towards the EU. So there's some gains to be had there, and I think really kind of getting back to that agenda would be my sort of first significant point here. The second one is, though, that when we look at the data and sort of collective analysis in this area, we tend to come down to some very oversimplified models, in my view, that are often detrimental to kind of operationalizing it in a concrete setting. Yeah? So you talked about previously the need for really having grounded understandings, localized settings. I think that's absolutely right, and this applies in this area as well, because behind a lot of these sort of mainstream things that we think we know are a lot of exceptions that apply. So, for instance, we know that the relationship, just like the relationship between poverty and crisis, the relationship between poverty and migration are bidirectional. Yeah, so crisis can lead to poverty, poverty can lead to crisis. Same thing for migration and poverty. It can also both reinforce and be regressive in this relationship. So even if we think about migration as poverty-reducing strategy, most of us also know, we've got something called the migration hump. It's not so easy to do the kind of preventive strategies that you talk about, because I've had discussions with your predecessor, Ole, on this issue, that even in Parliament in Denmark, there's some concerns that, if we make these types of FDA investments in migration-prone country, are we not actively kind of like creating out-of-country migration, all these things, etc.? What we're going to do about that? So we think we know something, but it actually becomes a barrier to action. And of course, behind that is sort of yet other studies that show that, this migration hump, this idea that once people get more money, they'll migrate out of country more and to a certain point, and then it goes the other way. Actually, that doesn't apply to internal migration, which is by far the largest of the displaced number that you talked about. There you have actually quite different dynamics. So this is going to be hugely important when we come to think about climate change and the points made in the report around climate mobility adaptation. It also doesn't really fit forced displacement per se. Yeah, I mean, this is a model that's developed for with a very different type of data set in mind for a number of obvious reasons. So not only are forced displacement sort of like, it doesn't follow this picture, it also means that forced displaced people overall tend to not profit to the same extent from migration. They tend to fall in that minority category where they're likely to be left, on average, more vulnerable. And so thinking creative about ways of doing that, I think some of the programs Charlotte mentioned, some of other programs and case studies from Uganda, from other countries, are really important ways of thinking through also, in a sense, the migration forced displacement nexus in these, right? I'll stop there. And then the last thing is, of course, that we really shouldn't think about these types of foreign direct aid as a kind of block phenomenon. We need to unpack that in and of itself. Yes, if we give people access to more money, education, etc., they can take those things elsewhere. But if we focus on good governance, on reducing corruption, on infrastructure, or indeed if we do initiatives which are about increasing protection capacity, both for internal displaced or preventive displacement, it's not likely to have these effects, at least only to a much more limited degree. So in sum, for the second point here is, I think we really need this type of data analysis, and we need these nuances and fine-grained studies that we can produce via the JDC, the World Bank reports, etc., to kind of bring these things together.